Hey there, welcome to episode 12 of this Koala Sampler tutorial series, and in today's episode we're going to talk all about sequencing and sort of building out tracks. So what we've got here, just a couple of drum sounds. I figure we'll just use drums for this example, and so we're going to just shift on over to the sequence page, of course. And then in the user interface video, I showed you where everything was, but this is where our sequence banks are here, and we've got 32 of these. I don't think I've ever got close to using anywhere near that many, and in the tips and tricks video, I'll kind of explain more about why that is. But for today, let's open up one of these sequences and use some of these drum sounds to try and just sort of program something in. So this is the sequencer window as you open it up. Across the top, we've got our transport controls. So when we press play here, of course, that's going to start running our sequence. That is based upon the BPM that you set here. So whatever you set in your tempo, that's going to be the tempo of your sequence. We've also got a record button, so when we want to record things in from our piano loop, or we're just like playing in pads or whatever, we've got the option to record things in as well. And that's just kind of like a slightly more organic way to like drawing these like little MIDI notes in, which I'm going to do in a second. The piano roll I'm going into in a separate video, so don't worry about that. I just feel like there's more to the piano roll that we need to talk about, so I just want to cover sequencing today. What we've got here down the bottom is the brush pen tool. We've got a velocity button, and we've got a chance button. We've also got some snapping options here. Let's set this to like 116 notes for now. And then we've got an undo and a redo. Now they're kind of the only times you can sort of undo and redo inside of Koala. I've spoke about that in some of the other videos, that generally if you're like editing on pads and things, if you make a mistake or you accidentally delete something, there's no way to undo it. In here, at least with the sequencing, you do get some of those options. So looking at the window itself, we have all of our samples down the left-hand side. And what's cool is when you load a sample in, it lights up blue here so that you know that there's something there ready to be played, and that corresponds to the 3 samples that we have across our pads here. But instead of course, the 16 by 16 sort of layout of your samples, they are now all located down the left-hand side, and it starts with the A, sort of the A bank, and we've got 16 samples there. Then we've got B, C, and D, of course, so that we've got all 64 samples ready to be played in a sequence if we want. All to the left-hand side. If we want to audition those samples so we know which ones we're using, we can just tap on them. Very cool, very handy. You don't want to be having to switch back to the other page to work out which pads you're playing around with. And of course, in terms of sort of like navigation, we can see like our measures across the top. We're currently on 1 bar. If we want to just, you know, go up to 2 bars, 3 bars, we can double up from there to 6. You get the idea. There isn't really much of a limitation to the sequence lengths. I've done things that are like 80 bars long. I can essentially put an entire track into one sequence bank. I don't need to use like 32 to make one song. I can just do the whole song in here. So don't think of it as too limited, because it's really not. We can also sort of navigate by scrolling with our finger. So if we want to go up and down like this, we can. If we make this sort of longer, or we zoom in a little bit, using 2 fingers, we can kind of zoom this way. Then 1 finger, I can scroll left and right as well. And of course, we've got this like sort of visual icon here of how sort of far we're zoomed in and stuff, which is really handy. And zoom up and down as well. So if you're struggling, if you're doing like stuff on the iPhone version, which I do quite often, definitely being able to zoom in is good, because, you know, if your finger's quite big, you'll end up like sort of hitting double notes and stuff. But let's just put some notes in so that we can look at the other functions. 1 bar loop, of course, and we got some drums. Gonna just do very standard pattern here, nothing fancy, but we'll put our kicks in, a couple of snares here, and then just add hi-hats right the way across the board, just like that, and I'll play that for you. Now again, with your samples, they're based upon how the sample is set in the edit window, and I believe all of these will be set as 1-shots. If they're not set as 1-shots, they're only going to play for as long as this note is in the sequence. So if you've got something that's like a long drum loop and you only allow this much of it to play, it's going to stop when it goes to here. If it's in one-shot mode, it's going to play the whole thing right the way through. But just keep that in mind. Like all the other aspects in Koala, it all comes back down to that editing window and whether your sample is a one-shot or, however it's set up. So that's the first thing to look at. So yeah, we've got a very basic pattern here. Some of the other things that we can do, of course, we can draw the notes in, like I've just shown you. We've got the ability to stretch the notes like I just did then. And so, yeah, if it's something that you're working maybe not in one-shot mode and you just want the sample to play for a certain amount of time, I can use just the end here to like drag that sample across to wherever I want it. And Koala's pretty clever because it remembers sort of the last, I suppose, the number of like MIDI note sort of squares that you last used. So if I add another note now here, it gives me 4 because I last used 4. If I go back to 1 and then add another note, it gives me 1. So it's kind of clever that it sort of remembers what you were using. And that comes in handy when you're, I don't know, say you've got a sample loaded up on this pad 1 and it's a bit of a loop and it plays for like half a bar. I don't necessarily want to have to stretch that out again when I draw it in here, but because I did half a bar there, it remembers half a bar here. So very clever little app for doing things like that. What else have we got? In terms of like stretching things, if you get to a point where you're like putting some samples in and things are starting to come off the grid, we've got like a few options here. So of course we've got snapping in the bottom window and we snap this to like 1/16 notes. We can change any of that, and we can also set it to completely free. So if I have one like note like this, if I draw it in, I can then shift it completely off the grid. And I do that a lot because I like working with a kind of more sort of natural sound. We can, if I leave that one off the grid actually for a second, I'll show you another function in a second. What you'll notice is that the end part here snaps to like the grid size or the like 1/16 note, whatever you're working with. If you want to be able to extend the little MIDI note but not have any problem with it snapping to the next grid line, we can turn snap end off. And then again with that, I can do in small increments. Sometimes when you've got like, yeah, a bunch of like samples playing, they might be just slightly off the grid. You don't want them overlapping or triggering other ones. So that's super useful to be able to do that as well. Let's set it back to 1/16. Now we have some other options. So we've got some options to like grab things. Now, all we do here is we just hold our finger on the screen and we'll get this like dashed square outline. And it's just like a little lasso tool. We can just grab things like that. And then I can shift things around. If I take something like this little note here, you'll notice we get like a bunch of different options. So I could delete this note. I could copy it. If I hit snap, it's going to pull it back to the grid for me, which is useful. It's going to pull it to whatever the nearest grid line is. We've got legato, which will stretch any note to the next note. You've got reverse. We've got 200% and 50%. That makes more sense when you have something like this. So if we just take all of our drum sounds here, and we know we've got a 1 bar loop running at, what did we set it at? 80 BPM, I think. If we play around with the 200% or the 50%, it adjusts the speed. So it's either going to speed it up or it's going to slow it down. If we do 200%, it's going to slow it down. If we undo that and we do it by 50%, it's going to speed it up. So now when we play it, kind of more into sort of drum and bass territory. We can also repeat the notes from there and like stretch them across. So now we've got obviously 1 bar worth of like our drum and bass sort of loops there. That's pretty cool. And I think that's it for the settings that are inside of there. What we got next is the velocity mode. So when we're in here, we can play around with our velocity. And I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit because I'm not sure how much it will show on the video screen here. But as we play around with each of these notes, we can change the note velocity. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, velocity is essentially just like volume, really. We can sort of change the volume of each of these notes. And I use that a lot because it's like something like these hi-hats. I don't want them all to be hitting exactly the same level because it sounds unnatural. I want them to kind of fluctuate a bit like a real drummer. And, sometimes you've got like the odd sample that's like a little bit loud, you can use velocity to come in and just tweak that a little bit. And of course, the lower the percentage, the quieter the sound, and the higher the percentage, the louder the sound is. We can do that. We can again use our little sort of lasso tool here to grab multiple notes and multiple things, and then when I shift those, I'm changing the velocity of multiple notes at the same time. That's really useful. And the other thing that we have in here, which was introduced sort of recently, was this chance or probability, as it's called in Ableton, button. And what that does is it gives you the option of saying, I'm just going to make these snares, sorry, a little bit loud for a second, just because I might use the snares as a demonstration. When we play around with the probability or the chance, it means the chance of, as this loop keeps rolling around, because as you'll notice when I press the play button here, it automatically loops around. Now, every time that loop comes around and it's playing all of these notes, if we don't set any probability, it's always going to play every single note here. But if you want to start adding some detail and some just like kind of natural changes in rhythm, or say you've got like, I don't know, we put another snare in here if we're in brush mode, kind of like a second like ghost snare. Maybe I only want that snare to hit every once in a while, like not every single time. I can use probability to change that, or chance as it's called here. And it's the same, like you get a percentage. So the higher the percentage, the more likely it is to play as that loop comes back around. And the less sort of percentage, you know, the lower percentage, the less likely it is to come around. So if we put it in the middle, let's just see what happens when I play the loop around a few times. Let's do another one as well, just so that we've got a couple going. Let's make that one a little bit lower. Just see every time as it comes around how many times it plays that. So you see there, it played it the first time around, then the second time around it skipped them. And it's really cool because if you want to add like more detail and more texture to like the drums, having that ability to have this just sort of randomness like come in, you could do it with like the hi-hats. You're just going to get these nice little like fluctuations in rhythm and tempo and stuff. So I think that's really cool. As I said, we've got some other features here. Let's say I draw a bunch of notes in and I've got them all here. I don't want any of them. I can undo them. I can simply redo them as well. And I think that pretty much takes care of it for the sort of sequencing window inside. So the next thing we need to talk about is our sequencing banks and how we can sort of manipulate those into a song. So I'm just going to keep with the drums. I'm not going to start bringing in other samples and things like that. I don't want to make it like overly complicated. But if we want to create a different drum loop, then of course we can do that inside of here, and we could play around and have a completely completely different pattern, and take out the hi-hats, do whatever. And this is essentially the building blocks for creating a song. So in one sequence I might create let's say I've just got like some drums and like a basic loop, keep it really simple. Maybe I just want the loop at the beginning of my song. So the first sequence would just be the loop. Then this next one I would make so that it is the loop and the drums. The next one could be the loop and the drums and a vocal. And that's how you sort of create the building blocks to make full tracks inside of Koala. Now, you can sort of manually trigger these. So if I hit play and then skip over here, you have to get your timing pretty well if you sort of want to do it that way. I don't tend to sequence anything out in that sort of fashion, but the option is there that you can sort of skip between the loops. And whenever it's in a sequence, it's just going to loop that one sequence until you change to the next sequence. And I know some people who do that. I don't think there's an option at the moment to MIDI map these, which would be kind of cool. It'd be cool to be able to trigger these from like a controller, but I don't think you can do that. So yeah. Let's say this was how I wanted to export my track out. This is my intro, this like really sparse little drum thing here. So I've got that as a pad. What I tend to do is I'll just choose another sequence bank because we've got so many of them that we can play with. I will drag that in and say, okay, this is my beginning. And as I said, that could just be like a plain loop. It could be anything. Then I want that to play for X amount of bars. I know that it's a 1-bar loop, so say I want 2 bars of this at the beginning of my track. What I can do is I can take this sequence and put it onto here, and then we get these options. Now, I can mix, which obviously, if we mix the same thing, it's not going to do anything because we've got the same notes on each one. Mixing these 2 sequences would be more, let's say you've built a drum loop here and some other kind of loop over here, and you just want to combine them to one thing. You can mix all the MIDI notes into one sequence. But in terms of building a song, I want 2 bars of this here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do add to end, and that is going to double up on our little loop here. Now, of course, I could have done that in the sequence window. I've got 1 bar here. If I want to double up, make the 2 bars before I start building the track. But I just want to show you the options that are available. So I've got 2 bars of kind of sparse drums here, and then I want to move into the next part of my track is going to be this thing with all these like busy drums. I just do the same thing again. I add this in here and I add it to the end, and now our little sparse drums are going to play, and then it's going to kick off into these. And again, it would just be a case of them working out the segments in my song. I want these are 1 bar 2, but I want them to play for 8 bars. I can simply drag this in and add to the end 8 times. Or if I've already worked it out beforehand, I can double this up until I've got 8 bars worth of it, and then just drag it in once and add it to the end. So that's how you build a track, or that's certainly how I build tracks. I generally build within the one sequence, and then once I have that sequence, I can go in here, I can hit record song, and then as I hit the record button, it's going to let me just play through and export that out. In fact, let's just do it as an example while we're here, because you might as well see how to record something out. But if I click, as you can see here, the little message that we're getting is just to say that as soon as I hit the play button, it's going to start recording. So I can do OK, and it won't do anything until I'm ready. Usually I'll jump over to like the performance page here, and let's just say this was going to be my track on this particular sequence. Hit this one, hit play, and you will see our recorder start to tick in. Gives us some indication of how long we're recording for and what our song's like. And then I add a bunch of effects. Bunch of mess and noise, but you get the idea. I can then name my song. Let's call it Turd, because that's what it sounded like. But then I've got the same export options here. So if I want to send anything out to my friends, I want to email it, I want to airdrop it over to my iMac, I've got all of those options there for my song. I can send it to other apps like Audio Share, take it in there, edit it, and do what I want. Now, the other thing to notice was that as you've got these here, it will just always continue to play as a loop. So keeping an eye on where your song structure is, if you've got like a quiet intro, then the song, and then the end. Of course, you can edit that in an external audio editor, but it's useful to keep an eye on sort of those things, because this will just keep looping forever. But that's essentially how I build an entire song and get that out. So yeah, I think that covers us for sequencing. Just trying to think if there's anything else I need to show you guys. I don't think there is. So I will catch you guys in the next episode. Take care.